So our tradition teaches that there is a special place in heaven for those who give tzedakah, and that there is actually a higher level that is reserved for those who make shidduchs between people. That's considered such an important thing to make a match. You're supposed to get a new pair of shoes and a place in heaven. But there's yet a third level, the higher level, the highest level, that's reserved for people who come to the annual meeting. So I just want to congratulate you for securing your spot in the world to come, for being among those who are showing up tonight. I will tell you that Marcia is taking note in particular. We're really grateful that you're here. And part of what I notice about looking at this crew is it's not just that you've shown up for the annual meeting. We know you are the people who show up, always show up, and have shown up for each other as well as supported us. So I just want to offer that gratitude for how you make this place what it is. So thank you for being here tonight. I was really lucky that I got to spend the last 2 days at an intensive orientation with the Shalom Hartman Institute for a rabbinic leadership intensive that I'm going to start on, which is a 3-year program in which I will be studying in Israel for the month of July for the next 4 summers, which is an incredible treat. And it's with a pluralistic group of rabbis, and they are extraordinary, a group of 28 of us. This is the first year in 7 different cohorts that there are actually a few more women than men for the first time, which is also interesting. And it happens to have the majority group are female Reform rabbis. So for me, it also is a particular treat to actually be amongst female Reform colleagues, and we've already kind of plotted the kind of work we want to do together. It's interesting that there are so many texts in the Jewish canon, but this particular rabbinic intensive is focusing on the Talmud, which is a compendium of Jewish law and stories that the rabbis put together. It was first an oral tradition, and then it was codified and kind of put into writing in about the 3rd century. And we asked the question, why study the Talmud? We have so many texts. Why is the Talmud going to be at the center? And the reason that the Hartman Institute gives, which I think I agree with as well, is that the reason why the Talmud is so worth studying is it's a text that was born out of crisis. And it was a text that is basically born out of the destruction of the temple, in which the entire way that Jews practiced Judaism was completely destroyed because it was a sacrificial cult, and then it had to completely change. And so the rabbis had to rethink everything. This was the major rupture of Jewish history. And out of that, they found ways to reconstruct. They didn't miss the opportunity of the crisis. And unfortunately or fortunately, in every single generation, the Jews have sort of faced in some way some kind of rupture, not nearly as perhaps as strong or as severe as the destruction of the temple, but we have had to use the Talmud as a source for wisdom for how you come through a crisis. And I guess the question I would ask right now, it's not just that the Talmud has stories and laws, but it actually deals with very specific questions around rising polarization and sectarianism, division within the Jewish community. That sort of sounds familiar. The fear around Jewish continuity and forgetting. They talk about the issues of external threats from those who want to get rid of the Jews. And the challenge of how do you define Judaism for a new generation. So these are the questions they asked at that rupture. These are the very same questions that we're asking, 2,000 years later. So I wonder if it is appropriate to call this moment a time of crisis. It might sound extreme to you, but I would say, I might posit that we are in a time of an extreme challenge for our community. And while I'm not a person who generally says this is a crisis time, in my 46 years of living, this might be the highest moment of crisis for the Jewish community that I've experienced in my own lifetime. So in order to kind of understand what does this moment of crisis look like, I actually wanted to do a moment of like zooming out and thinking about the role of where we are as a faith kind of community in the world in which faith is just diminishing in importance in America. So I wanted to give you a couple of key points. It used to be that in America, the moral voices were voices of religious figures, people like Martin Luther King Jr., or go back, William Sloane Coffin. Often it was ministers and pastors and rabbis, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who were moral voices of our day. And as religion has sort of diminished in its kind of visibility, there haven't really been people who've come in to take that mantle on. I don't think that we're hearing it from our politicians. We're not necessarily hearing it from our celebrities. So who has filled that void? It used to be, I don't know if you know, that on the front page of the New York Times, they used to actually print the sermons of like the 3 major pulpits for the Sunday sermons on the Monday morning Times. So it just gives you a different sense of how religion played a role in America that it no longer plays. And I was struck, because we've been doing some research for the 180th anniversary of Central, how many stories about Central Synagogue were in the New York Times and other newspapers, including in the 1880s, a big debate between 2 rabbis, the Rabbi Kohut of Central Synagogue and Rabbi Kaufman Kohler, who was one of the founders of the Reform movement. And this was a theological debate that the New York Times thought was worthy of reporting on 3 different times in the newspaper. So this just gives you a sense like these were the kinds of things that people were struggling with. Now it's very hard to find any coverage on anything like that. So that I think is interesting to think about. The fastest growing religious group in America today are the nuns. I don't mean Catholic women. I mean N-O-N-E, none. I have no religion. That is the fastest growing group. And among millennials, it's over 40%. So to think about the fact that the next generation feels like they have no use for religion. I learned a stunning fact that 3,500 churches a year close in America right now. Think of that, 3,500 churches a year. And synagogues we don't have enough of those to close that fast, but we also know that we are also closing down synagogues and merging them. And that it used to be that a large congregation definition from the Reform movement was 1,200 families. Now I believe it's 900 families. And we used to have over 50 of them. Now we have a little under 50. But the point is, it's all kind of retreating. And it is something that we need to be concerned about. What is lost with this lack of, faith in communities? Well, I'm a person who really believes that congregational life is one of the foundational structures that actually build community and cohesion and increase our sense of humanity and diversity in this country. So it's not just synagogues. I'm talking about places of worship or places where people of different ages came together, people of different political persuasions would come together and would just meet and be together. So when we lose that kind of fabric is sort of also lost. So I think that's a huge part. We also know that we have basically an epidemic of loneliness in America, that a healthcare insurance company, Cigna, took out a big study on loneliness because actually loneliness deeply affects your physical health. And over 50% of Americans said they feel lonely. So I'm going to guess that because we know that's a high number, that there are people in this room who feel that way. There are people in this congregation that feel that way. So I think that is also a net result of the kind of diminution of congregational life. So I think in some ways, Central Synagogue has this incredible spiritual technology of what congregational life can be. And I think it's what people deeply want. And I think that this is why people are coming. But I also think that we're bucking a trend that is very different in all of America right now. I would just offer also that, let's zoom in a little bit and just talk about the Jewish world, which I think you guys know some of these facts and figures, but I just think it's interesting. You know that we have an incredibly high intermarriage rate. I'm not one of the people that thinks that that is going to be the end of the Jewish people. There are people who think that it is. But I do think that it creates a challenge for us to really be able to be as welcoming and inclusive as possible so that people can really feel like they can be a part of our community. I learned a very interesting fact. Did you know that in 2012 there was a study, and there are over 5% of our Jewish community are people who are not actually Jewish but identify as Jewish, but never converted, never necessarily took a formal step, but they actually consider themselves Jews, or they were born, they're even another religion. Many of them live in a Jewish home, but it's just interesting that it's not even, we've actually done a pretty good job of helping people actually feel like they can belong in the community in some way. But I think that's something for us to think about. We are having a very, it's a challenge to find people to go into rabbinic school and cantorial school. Almost all the classes at HUC, JTS, RRC are shrinking. And so we have a lot of work to do in the larger Jewish community. And of course, we know that we have seen more hate crimes directed at Jews. We are still, this year than ever before, we are still the group most targeted over every other group in America for hate crimes. This year we saw the deadliest attack on Jews in American history, and it was not the last one. And we have a growing unease as we see a normalization of anti-Semitic language that's happening all around us, including even in the New York Times. So I think that, and let's also just mention the challenge of this growing divide between Israeli and diaspora Jews. So, is it a crisis? I think that we have a lot that is extremely challenging and feels like it's at an extreme point, both in terms of the challenges of faith in general in America, but also to the Jewish community. So, what would we say? I would say that don't waste the opportunity of a crisis. And we at Central in particular, as I said, we have bucked a lot of these trends. And how have we done that? I think in some ways we've learned from one of the lessons that we've had, which was our own crisis. I would just name that when Central Synagogue had our fire, which was 20 years ago, our community was about 1,300 families, which had grown from about 900 families, which is what it was when Rabbi Rubenstein came to Central Synagogue. And he was fairly certain that after the fire, if we didn't have our beautiful landmark building, that we were going to lose members. But actually, the fire set off the fastest period of growth in Central's history. Over the next 8 years, it grew 700 families in those 8 years, if you can believe it. So to 2,000 families the year that I arrived in 2006. So I think that tells you something, because what happened was in that crisis moment, we had to actually identify who are we aside from a building? Like, what is the soul of this place? And that's what we had to seek out and find. So we did not waste the opportunity of that crisis. And then we have grown steadily since then. We still have a wait list that is hundreds of families big. And here we are 20 years later, we are twice the size that we were in 1998 when the fire happened. And to put this in context, this is at the same time that many synagogues around us in New York have just been shrinking. So this is not just happening everywhere, but I think that in some ways that crisis pushed us forward. When I think about the crisis of what happened with Pittsburgh, which was devastating for our community, I also think about what it felt like to have the governor here speaking from our bima saying that New York and the diversity of New York is what makes us strong, and seeing a packed sanctuary and having over a dozen interfaith leaders standing beside us. And it wasn't just that, it was a standing room only crowd on Friday night where we had people visiting us from churches and mosques that had never stepped foot in a synagogue before but came with us. But I think maybe even more important than all of that were the relationships that happened even after that. We got 2 different invitations from 2 different imams to go to iftar meals for Ramadan this week because of relationships that got forged out of that Pittsburgh meeting, that we didn't know them before. So I think that there is something about those moments that can create opportunity for a different kind of connection. You heard from Jeremy about what it was like when the New Zealand mosque shooting happened, that it was actually a few members in this room were among those who wanted to show solidarity with our neighbors. So they stood outside that mosque in solidarity. And it was because they were out there that there were some clergy out there too. And that's how we knew when they couldn't get into their building because they had a fire that same week. And so we invited them here. That was a beautiful story. The story went viral. It was a beautiful thing. But I think you should know that the epilogue of that was that, some of you were at services, so you know this, is that that relationship continued. So he invited us then the next week to visit him, and then he came and spoke at Central 2 weeks ago after the second shooting in San Diego. And so that is, and then he invited us to iftar as well. So here we are, taking a crisis, not wasting that opportunity, using it to actually build bridges that didn't really exist before. Because I have to say, in my 5 years as rabbi, we had never had one conversation, which I'm embarrassed to say, until the crisis. So these are things that I think that we can learn from our tradition and how to thrive and survive. I am not going to go through, I think many of the things that I think that have been extremely successful, because I think Jeremy did them really, really well. But I will just remind us of these 4 R's that I think really are operating principles that have helped us come out of crisis moments and really actually thrive. One is that we just continue to put relationships at the center of who we are, that this community is built one relationship at a time. And we do that both with people who are from outside the community, people who have felt like they wouldn't have ever walked foot in a synagogue. And I also say that you are our partners in that. And especially when I look around this room, I know people who have connected with other people in this community, who reach out and introduce themselves when they're at services, who invite people to their homes. It's enormously beautiful, and it is at the soul of who we are as a community. Continuing to reform, I think about the fact that we are always looking to how we can improve things. I hope you felt that with the way we're changing high holiday services, our educational offerings, this new database system that we're going to have. So that's, I think, also really important. Being radically inclusive, we want to be able to, the fact that we've had imams on our bima, that we've had, that we talked about actually live kidney donation last week. There is a way that we are really trying to stretch the boundaries of what it means like to really be a community that really thinks of all people and all needs. And then I think thinking about being resource abundant. I think one of the things that synagogues can fall into the trap of is feeling like, well, there's a finite pot and we've got to keep, ours, otherwise we don't have enough to share. And I think that the idea that we have, that we are thinking about abundance, not scarcity, means that we share everything that we have and that there's always more, that more creates more. And so you should know that one of the things I'm proudest of is that a lot of the things that we create at Central, we share with other synagogues, from our music to our programming to project-based learning with our Hebrew school. These are all things that we want to share with the larger community, and that our clergy and staff share our best practices in the larger movement. So this is part of how we help not just ourselves, but the larger community. So I feel incredibly grateful that, that this work is done in partnership with you and also with the most extraordinary staff team. I just want to say that first to my clergy colleagues, that you guys are the most incredible people to work with, and that your passion and compassion that you bring to your work inspires me every day, and it also is really fun to work with you. To the larger team that we get to work with, we just have the highest quality staff team. I just can't say it enough, and it is a privilege to work with them. To Marcia Caban, our unbelievable executive director, I feel like my true partner in crime. You do not just all the legwork behind the scenes, but also you've been an unbelievable support to all the crazy dreaming that we like to do here, and we are so, so grateful. And to your entire team that really makes this place run beautifully. I want to make a shout out specifically to Valerie, who particularly made sure that this meeting would happen beautifully tonight. So where is Valerie? Thank you. To our lay leadership, which is truly extraordinary. So, so grateful to have your guidance. Jeremy Fielding, this has been a very, very wonderful first year. And I want to just make special note again of those 2 trustees whose term has ended after many, many years of service. Shelley Mitchell, whose compassion and wisdom has been a steady guide. Jeffrey Wilkes, who has tirelessly kept our financial health and good, clean audits. And I really also want to thank our 2 incredible officers who are coming off the EC. So Moses Silverman, you have been such a moral compass for us, really truly is, and your sense of justice has kept at us with all the hard questions, and I really cannot thank you enough for that. And I know that you'll continue to say them to us even when you're not on the EC. And to Rich Markowitz, who's been our treasurer, our supporter, our friend. All I can say is that you have been an invaluable partner in some of, I think, the most challenging moments. And it's not just been around finance, but around staffing and around issues of our culture. And I also we have felt so deeply supported by you. So we're incredibly grateful to you for your service. So in this time of crisis, which I think we're in, there is opportunity. And Central has been built to know how to operate in that. And we're not going to do it just with our our history, but also with the fact that we are grounded by a tradition that has taught us how to operate in a time of crisis. And we're going to draw upon that for strength. And it is, I just want to say personally that it is such an extraordinary privilege to serve this community as your rabbi. I really feel every day that it is a tremendous blessing. I don't know how I got here, but I just thank God that this is where I was called to serve, and really feel like I look around and see a community of such beautiful people, and it makes it, while it is sometimes, the job feels sometimes a little bit heavy, all I can say is that because I don't have to lift it by myself and I get to lift it with all of you, it feels extraordinarily sacred. So thank you. We'll end with a line of Talmud which says, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Thank you.